Imagine you are 22 years old, strapped into the cockpit of a Japanese dive bomber, 300 miles from the nearest friendly deck, flying toward a wall of American steel that stretches from horizon to horizon. Below you, 15 aircraft carriers wait, their decks bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Above you, hundreds of American fighters are already climbing to meet you. You know in your heart that you will probably not come home tonight, and you are not alone. Hundreds of young men just like you are flying this exact mission at this exact moment, into what history will remember, not as a battle, but as a slaughter. On June 19, 1944, in the waters east of the Mariana Islands, the United States Navy would shoot Japanese planes out of the sky with such ease, in such staggering numbers, that the pilots themselves began comparing it to something else entirely. Not a battle, a hunt. They called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. And by the time the sun set on the second day of fighting, Japan's naval air power, the pride of its empire, the force that had struck Pearl Harbor 2.5 years earlier, would cease to exist as a fighting force. This is the story of how it happened, why it happened, and what it cost. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is one of the most one-sided, most consequential, and most misunderstood battles of the entire Second World War. By the spring of 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a point of no return for the Empire of Japan. 2.5 years earlier, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been the most feared naval air force on the planet. Its pilots were among the best-trained aviators in the world, veterans of years of combat over China, hardened professionals who could fly, fight, and land on a pitching carrier deck in conditions that would terrify most Western pilots. But that force, the force that hit Pearl Harbor, the force that swept through the Pacific in the opening months of the war, had been bled white. At midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, and more importantly, hundreds of its most experienced pilots and maintenance crews in a single afternoon. At the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz, at Rabaul, at the endless grinding air battles over the Solomon Islands, Japan kept feeding its remaining veteran aviators into the meat grinder, and one by one, they died. By early 1944, the men who had once been the elite of naval aviation were almost all gone, killed in action, missing, buried at sea or not buried at all. What replaced them was a desperate, accelerated pipeline of barely trained replacements. Where a Japanese carrier pilot in 1941 might have had 700 hours of flight time before ever seeing combat, by 1944 that number had collapsed to 200 hours, sometimes less. Fuel shortages meant training squadrons could not fly enough hours to properly prepare their students. Many of these new pilots had never practiced a night landing. Some had barely practiced landing on a carrier at all. They were being sent to war half-finished, thrown into cockpits and told to fight against an enemy that, by contrast, was only getting stronger. Because on the American side, the exact opposite was happening. The United States Navy of 1944 bore almost no resemblance to the shattered, outgunned fleet that had limped away from Pearl Harbor in December 1941. American shipyards, running at a pace the Japanese simply could not match, were pumping out fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in numbers that seemed almost fictional. The Essex-class carriers alone were being commissioned faster than Japan could sink them, faster, in truth, than Japan could even meaningfully engage them. By June of 1944, Task Force 58, under the command of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, had grown into the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled in human history up to that point. 15 aircraft carriers, nearly 900 aircraft, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 69 destroyers. It was not a fleet. It was a floating city of firepower, and it was steaming directly toward the Mariana Islands. And the Marianas mattered enormously. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not just specks of land in the middle of the Pacific. They were the key to the next stage of the entire war. Whoever controlled the Marianas controlled airfields capable of basing the brand-new American B-29 Superfortress bomber, an aircraft with the range to strike the Japanese home islands directly for the first time in the war. Tokyo itself, Osaka, Nagoya, the industrial heart of Japan, all of it would fall within range of American heavy bombers flying from Saipan. For Japan, losing the Marianas did not just mean losing territory. It meant losing the outer wall of the homeland's defenses. It meant the war coming to Japan's own doorstep. This is why, when American forces began landing on Saipan on June 15, 1944, the Japanese High Command understood that they could not simply let this happen. They had to respond with everything they had left. That response was Operation Ago, and it rested entirely on the shoulders of Vice Admiral Gisafabuzo Ozawa, commander of Japan's first mobile fleet. Ozawa was not a reckless man. He was, by most accounts, one of the more capable and thoughtful admirals remaining in the Imperial Navy, and he understood better than almost anyone the desperate state of his air groups. But he also believed he held one crucial advantage: geography itself. Japanese aircraft, built for range at the expense of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, could strike American ships from roughly 300 miles away. American aircraft, heavier and better protected, needed to close to around 200 miles to strike effectively. Ozawa's plan depended on this gap. He intended to launch his planes at maximum range, let them hit the American carriers, and then have them land at airfields on Guam to refuel and rearm before flying a second strike on the way back, a tactic the Japanese called shuttle bombing. On paper, it was clever. It might even have worked 5 years earlier against a less capable enemy, with less capable technology arrayed against him. But Ozawa did not know two things that would doom his plan before a single plane left the deck. The first was that American submarines had already been shadowing his fleet for days, radioing its position, course and speed back to Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. The Americans knew Ozawa was coming. They knew roughly where. And Spruance, cautious by nature and determined above all else to protect the invasion beachhead on Saipan, made the fateful decision to hold Task Force 58 in a defensive posture rather than charging out to meet the Japanese fleet head-on. It was a decision that would be debated by historians for decades, some arguing Spruance threw away a chance to annihilate the entire Japanese fleet, others arguing he made exactly the right call by refusing to risk the amphibious landing. But whatever the wisdom of that decision, it meant one thing above all else for June 19th. The Japanese planes would have to come to the Americans, and when they did, they would be flying into a wall. The second thing Ozawa did not know, and could not have known, was that the United States Navy possessed a technological advantage so overwhelming that it would render his entire strategy meaningless before it even began. That advantage was radar, combined with something called the Combat Information Center, a coordinated system that allowed American ships to detect incoming enemy aircraft from well over 100 miles away and vector-defending fighters to intercept them with terrifying precision. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their pilots would be flying, essentially, into an ambush they could not see coming, guided toward waiting Hellcats by voices on the radio who already knew exactly where they were, how many there were, and roughly what altitude they were flying at. There was also the matter of the aircraft themselves. The primary American fighter defending the fleet that day was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a plane purpose built after painful lessons learned, fighting the nimble Japanese Zero earlier in the war. The Hellcat was not as maneuverable as the Zero, but it did not need to be. It was faster, it dove better, it carried heavier armament, and critically, it was armored, with self-sealing fuel tanks that let it absorb hits that would turn a Zero into a fireball. It was flown on this day by pilots who in many cases had well over 300 hours of flight training backed by experienced squadron leaders, many of whom were already aces. The mismatch was not close. It was not even really a fair fight in the traditional sense of the word. It was, as one American pilot later put it, almost like being back at gunnery school, except this time the targets were shooting back badly. Now picture the morning of June 19, 1944. Dawn breaks over a calm Philippine sea. Aboard the American carriers, pilots are already being briefed, their coffee going cold as radar operators report the first faint contacts appearing on their scopes, still well over 100 miles out. Aboard the Japanese carriers, hundreds of miles to the west, young pilots climb into cockpits, many of them flying their first combat mission, some of them flying their last training flight only weeks before. At around 10 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese planes lifts off, 69 aircraft strong, climbing and forming up before turning east toward the American fleet. They never had a chance to achieve surprise. American radar picked up the formation while it was still roughly 150 miles away, giving Mitcher's fighter controllers a luxury almost unheard of in naval air combat up to that point. Time to scramble additional fighters, time to vector them precisely, time to stack multiple layers of defending Hellcats at different altitudes so that the incoming Japanese formation would have to fight through wave after wave before ever reaching the ships. By the time the first wave of Japanese aircraft closed to within 60 miles of the fleet, they were already being torn apart. Hellcats dove out of the sun, guns hammering, and Japanese planes began falling from the sky in numbers that stunned even the American pilots doing the shooting. Of the 69 aircraft in that first raid, all 42 were shot down before they ever got close enough to drop a bomb or launch a torpedo. And this pattern repeated itself, wave after wave, for the rest of the day. The second Japanese raid, 130 aircraft strong, fared even worse proportionally, intercepted so far from the fleet that fewer than half even reached visual range of the American ships, and of those that did, almost all were shot down before or immediately after their attack runs. American pilots, many of them, described the fighting not with the language of desperate combat, but almost with a strange, uncomfortable ease. One famous radio transmission from an American pilot that day summed up the entire mood of the battle in a single line, describing the sky as being so full of burning Japanese planes that it looked, quite literally, like a giant turkey shoot. That phrase stuck. It stuck because it was brutally accurate. The third and fourth Japanese raids fared no better, and in some cases worse, hampered by confused navigation, by pilots simply unable to find the American fleet at all, by fuel running low before they even reached combat, by American fighters seemingly waiting for them at every possible altitude and approach vector. Squadron after squadron of Japanese aircraft, flown by young men who had trained for months instead of years, were cut down by Hellcat pilots who, in many cases, described individual dogfights lasting only seconds before the enemy plane simply exploded or spiraled into the sea trailing smoke. By the end of the day on June 19th, Japan had launched roughly 370 carrier aircraft in 4 major strikes. Fewer than 100 returned to their carriers. The United States Navy, in one of the most lopsided air battles in the history of warfare, had lost 23 aircraft, and most of those pilots were recovered alive. But the air battle, staggering as it was not even the worst news for Ozawa's fleet that day. While his planes were being annihilated in the sky, disaster struck from beneath the waves. The American submarine Albacore, patrolling exactly where American intelligence had predicted the Japanese fleet would pass, fired a spread of torpedoes at what her captain believed was a large carrier. One torpedo struck home, slamming into the brand-new Japanese carrier Taiho, Ozawa's own flagship, the newest and most modern carrier in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy, a ship believed by her own crew to be nearly unsinkable, protected by an armored flight deck specifically designed to resist exactly this kind of damage. Initially, the damage seemed almost trivial. One torpedo hit, some flooding, nothing that appeared to threaten the ship. But below decks, an inexperienced damage control officer made a catastrophic decision, ordering ventilation systems open throughout the ship in an attempt to clear the fumes from ruptured aviation fuel lines. Instead of clearing the fumes, this decision spread highly volatile gasoline vapor throughout the entire vessel, filling compartment after compartment with an invisible, waiting bomb. For hours the Taiho steamed on, seemingly fine, seemingly saved. And then, in the middle of the afternoon, a single spark somewhere deep inside the ship ignited those accumulated vapors in one massive, catastrophic explosion that tore the ship apart from the inside, buckling her hull, blowing out her sides, and dooming her within minutes. Ozawa himself, along with his staff, barely escaped, transferring his flag to another vessel as his flagship, the newest fleet carrier in the Japanese Navy, sank beneath the waves on her very first combat deployment. She was not alone. That same day, another American submarine, Kavala, stalked the veteran carrier Shokaku, one of the 2 carriers that had launched the strike on Pearl Harbor 2.5 years earlier, one of the last surviving links to that opening moment of the Pacific War. Kavala fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 struck home, and within hours, fires raging out of control, her own aviation fuel and munitions cooking off in secondary explosions, Shokaku rolled over and sank, taking most of her crew down with her. So by the close of June 19th, in a single day, without a single American surface ship exchanging fire with a single Japanese surface ship, Ozawa had lost 2 fleet carriers to submarines and roughly 300 aircraft to Hellcats. It was by any measure one of the most catastrophic single days any navy has ever suffered in the history of naval warfare. And astonishingly, Ozawa did not yet fully grasp the scale of what had happened. Communications confusion aboard his new flagship meant reports of the aircraft losses were badly underestimated, and believing his air groups were still largely intact. Having landed safely on Guam as planned, Ozawa made the decision to remain in the area, intending to refuel and strike again. This decision set the stage for June 20th, and for one of the most dramatic and desperate moments of the entire battle on the American side this time. Throughout the 20th, American search planes hunted for the retreating Japanese fleet, and it was not until late in the afternoon, around 4 in the afternoon, with the sun already sinking toward the horizon, that a search plane finally located Ozawa's remaining ships, roughly 275 miles away, at the very edge, and arguably beyond the safe edge, of American strike range. Mitcher faced an agonizing decision. Launching a strike at this range and this hour meant his pilots would almost certainly be flying home in darkness, low on fuel, over open ocean, hundreds of miles from any friendly airfield, attempting night carrier landings that many of them had never practiced. It was, by any conventional standard, an extremely risky, arguably reckless order to give. But Mitcher understood something else too, that this might be the only chance the United States Navy would ever get to finish off what remained of Japan's carrier fleet. He gave the order to launch. 240 American aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and their fighter escorts roared off the decks of Task Force 58 and turned west, racing the setting sun toward a target at the absolute limit of their range. They found Ozawa's fleet just as dusk was falling, and in a furious, chaotic engagement lasting barely 20 minutes, American pilots pressed home their attacks with everything they had left. They sank the carrier Hio, hit and damaged 2 other carriers, sank an oiler, and damaged several other vessels, all while running desperately low on fuel themselves, all while Japanese anti-aircraft fire and the few remaining Japanese fighters still tried to bring them down. And then, their bombs and torpedoes expended, the American pilots turned east again, into a darkness that was now nearly complete, facing a flight home that many of them privately doubted they would survive. What happened next has become one of the most famous moments in the entire history of naval aviation. As returning American pilots, many of them critically low on fuel, some flying on fumes, radioed in their position, desperately trying to find their carriers in the pitch-black ocean night, Admiral Mitcher made an extraordinary decision. He gave the order to turn on the lights. Every carrier in Task Force 58, every destroyer, every cruiser, lit up, searchlights stabbing into the night sky, flight deck lights blazing, breaking every rule of naval blackout discipline, exposing the entire fleet to potential submarine attack, all so that his returning pilots would have something, anything, to navigate toward in the darkness. It worked, but not without terrible cost. Dozens of aircraft, simply out of fuel, ditched into the sea in the darkness, their pilots and crews scrambling into life rafts, bobbing alone in the black ocean, waiting and praying for rescue. Some planes crash-landed on the wrong carriers in the chaos and confusion. Some simply never made it back at all. By the time the night was over, roughly 80 American aircraft had been lost, not to enemy fire, but to fuel exhaustion and the sheer brutal physics of asking men to fly nearly 600 miles round trip at the absolute edge of their aircraft's endurance. And yet, in one of the most remarkable rescue efforts of the entire Pacific War, American destroyers and flying boats spent the following days combing the ocean, and the overwhelming majority of those downed pilots and aircrew, more than 3/4 of them, were pulled from the sea alive. It was a heavy price, but it was a price paid to bring men home rather than to lose them. When the smoke cleared and the final numbers were tallied, the scale of what had happened at the Battle of the Philippine Sea became almost impossible to overstate. Japan had lost 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio, along with roughly 600 aircraft between carrier planes and land-based air groups thrown into the fighting. Far more devastating than the ships or even the planes was the loss of pilots, the last meaningful generation of trained Japanese naval aviators, men who could never be replaced in the time Japan had left in the war. The United States Navy, by contrast, lost around 130 aircraft total across both days of fighting, the majority of those lost not to Japanese guns but to the desperate fuel-starved flight home on the night of June 20th, and the vast majority of those aircrew survived. No American ships were lost. It remains to this day one of the most lopsided naval air battles in recorded history. The strategic consequences were just as decisive as the tactical ones. With its carrier air power effectively annihilated, the Imperial Japanese Navy would never again be able to seriously challenge the United States Navy in a fleet carrier action for the remainder of the war. When the two navies clashed again, months later, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan's carriers would be used not as strike weapons but as bait, decoys with almost no aircraft aboard them, sent to lure American forces away from the real battle. because there was simply nothing left to put on their decks. The Marianas themselves fell soon after, Saipan in early July, Guam and Tinian shortly thereafter, and within months, American B-29 superfortresses were taking off from freshly built airfields on those very islands, beginning the long-range bombing campaign that would eventually bring the war directly to the Japanese home islands themselves. In a very real sense, the road that led to the final chapters of the Pacific War, and to everything that followed, was paved by what happened in the skies over the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th, 1944. And yet, despite its scale, despite its consequences, the Battle of the Philippine Sea has never captured the public imagination the way Midway or Pearl Harbor have. There is no single dramatic image, no iconic photograph that defines it in popular memory. Perhaps that is because so much of the battle was, in truth, one-sided, a demonstration of overwhelming industrial and technological advantage rather than a close-run, dramatic contest of equals. But for the young Japanese pilots who flew into that wall of American steel and fire on June 19th, many of them barely out of flight school, and for the American pilots who flew that desperate, fuel-starved mission into the darkness on June 20th, trusting their admiral to somehow bring them home, this was one of the most intense, terrifying, and consequential days of their entire lives. It deserves to be remembered, not just as a lopsided statistic, but as a human story, of courage on both sides, of a nation's air power dying in a single afternoon, and of an American commander who broke every rule in the book because he refused to let his men die in the dark. So here is the question I want to leave you with today. Admiral Mitcher's decision to turn on the lights that night saved dozens of American lives, but it also exposed his entire fleet to potential submarine attack in open, dangerous waters. Do you think that was the right call, a brave and necessary act of leadership, or was it an unacceptable risk that could have cost far more than it saved? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear your take on this. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most decisive and overlooked naval battles, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and give this video a like if you want to see more content just like this. It genuinely helps this channel grow and lets me keep bringing you these stories. Thank you so much for watching all the way through, and I will see you in the next one.